Today in our Racelab, we are not talking about high-flying tech or motorcycle handling dynamics for once. Today it's about something much more trivial, maneuvering and handling the bike while it's stationary. What you need to watch out for and what aids are available for it, you'll see right after the intro. Tip-overs happen at a standstill more often than when riding, and that's exactly why today we want to deal with simple things like proper maneuvering, especially to give you beginners a bit of a helping hand and make life with a motorcycle, particularly handling it, a bit easier. Who doesn't know this? A heavy bike often has to be maneuvered into a small garage and maybe even parked in reverse, which isn't exactly easy. You can usually feel the first beads of sweat on your forehead. But does it always have to be like that? With a few tricks, you can make things a lot easier and get the bike exactly where you want it without risking damage. And how we do that, we'll take a detailed look at now. The first important point you should keep in mind when you want to maneuver the bike is that it really needs to be upright and balanced around its center of gravity. Everyone knows it. If the bike is leaned over at a certain angle, it feels heavier and heavier, obviously because it's increasingly trying to tip over. That's why it's important to keep it as upright as possible. I'll demonstrate it briefly. Coming off the stand, I need quite a bit of force to bring the bike into that neutral upright position. But once I've got it here, more or less 2 fingers are enough to keep the bike level and balance continuously. And that means I've got all my strength available to actually get the bike moving without having to hold it upright with lots of force the whole time. One thing to add though, it's good not to hold it completely upright, but slightly lean towards you. That way, you don't run the risk of it tipping over to the opposite side. Because if that happens, you can't really catch it properly. It's obvious. Once it starts falling away from you, you have to step after it. And at some point, your body simply can't follow any further. And then the bike will naturally go over. So always keep an eye on it. Stay close to the center of gravity and tilt it very slightly toward your body. Then you still don't need much force to hold it, but it's safely on your side and you don't run the risk of losing it to the other side. Let's move on to the second point. The second point is closely related to the first. It's about the bike's balance, so we can keep it stable without effort. This is about not making fast steering inputs while maneuvering because of the bike's trail. Trail defines the contact patch's position relative to the steering axis. It's not exactly the same point. The trail is always behind the steering axis where it intersects the ground. And that means if we start turning the bars quickly, that shift in the contact patch also suddenly changes the bike's center of gravity. On a bike like the one we have here, it isn't quite as dramatic because trail is relatively small on sporty bikes. But take, for example, a chopper, a Harley Davidson, for instance. That's a heavy bike and usually has a lot of trail. And if you've ever noticed it, when you start turning the bars while stationary, not riding, just standing, you suddenly feel how the bike's weight distribution changes abruptly. That alone often leads to drops and tip-overs, because if you're not doing it consciously, you can get overwhelmed by the extra force suddenly required. And if you don't have a solid footing, you'll often topple over. The trick here when maneuvering and having to move the bars into different end positions is to do it slowly and factor in that shift of the contact point under the bike as part of your balance. If you want to know exactly how trail is created, we've already produced a dedicated episode on that. You can have a look and it's explained there in detail. The third point is quite simple. You should try to push the bike from the left-hand side. Most people, when they first get into motorcycling, are used to the bike being parked on the left on the side stand, so they also tend to mount or handle it from that side. And that's why you're simply much more practiced at handling the bike from the left than from the right. Since I've spent many years with motorcycles, I also find it very difficult to load a bike from the right-hand side, for example, up a ramp. So a good tip most people do it instinctively anyway, is to handle the whole thing from the left, because it's generally much easier for everyone. The next point you shouldn't underestimate is having secure footing. When you start pushing the bike or want to push it or want to lift it off the stand, you need a bit of force straight away. Now, and you transfer that through your feet into the ground. That's why good footwear and good grip are essential. We don't always have grippy surfaces like we do here. This carpet is obviously perfect. Often in workshops or garages, you'll find oily floors, or at the petrol station when you've got some spilled fuel you've picked up on the sole of your boot. That can quickly lead to dangerous situations where you start losing grip. So make sure you've got good footwear and proper grip before you start pushing the bike. The next point is something you also shouldn't neglect. Make sure you don't have a gear engaged while pushing. Why is that? With the engine off, especially when it's cold. It's often the case that if I select a gear, pull in the clutch and try to push, you still feel resistance because the clutch is stiff when the oil is cold. There's a lot of drag between the clutch plates as they rotate against each other, and you notice that when pushing. So the effort needed to push a bike with first gear engaged is clearly higher than in neutral. That's why it's always good to know you're in neutral and not in gear. The only exception where you might use it as a help is on a steep downhill. If I want more resistance so the bike doesn't roll too fast when pushing downhill, then I can use that. Or as an emergency anchor, if it really starts getting too fast, I can just let the clutch out briefly, and thanks to engine braking with the engine not running, I can slow the bike down immediately. Otherwise, on flat ground, always make sure neutral is selected. It takes far less effort. Next, make sure the side stand is folded up. When pushing on uneven ground, it's essential, especially if you're trying to push the bike backwards. Why when pushing backwards? Easy to explain. When pushing forwards, if the stand is down and it touches the ground, it usually folds back automatically. When pushing backwards, you don't have that convenience. It's in its end position and stays there if it gets a force from behind pushing it forwards, which is of course the point. Otherwise, it would fold away when you normally park the bike. And if we now start pushing the bike backwards on uneven ground with the stand down, you eventually get a situation where the wheels are lower, for example, than the middle of the bike, because there's a bump in the middle. And then I'll demonstrate it briefly. A stand that's down will, when it hits a raised area, automatically lever the bike over to the other side because it gets pushed by that obstacle. And then there's a big risk the bike will tip over to the opposite side. To prevent that, it's important when maneuvering, especially on uneven ground, to keep the stand folded up. And as long as you keep the bike in a reasonably upright position, you don't really need the stand as an emergency anchor anyway, because there aren't any big forces involved. Up to now, we've always been talking about things with the bike stationary. Now it's about how to get the bike moving in the best way. The simplest and most trivial approach is, of course, when you want to push it forwards. Grab the bars. The advantage is not only a good grip and a good connection to the bike, but you can also control the steering angle very well and feed force in very effectively through the bars. That means if we just want to push forwards, grab here and, as we said earlier, stay around the center of gravity. And you can get the bike moving forwards incredibly easily. So what about pushing the bike backwards? For forwards, we said hold the bars. When pushing backwards, there are a few other things to keep in mind. If you only grab the bars from the front like this, it's already incredibly hard to look in the other direction because we want to maneuver the bike backwards. And if you let it roll backwards, the rear end often starts wanting to swing out in one direction. You can hardly feel that from the front at the bars. And because you can't really turn your head properly in that direction either, this position isn't suitable for pushing backwards at all. So what's best? The simplest way is keep your left hand on the left grip. That stabilizes the bike really well, and you can still make steering inputs. And for the force, you need to get the bike moving backwards. It's best to place your right hand somewhere on the rear of the bike. That's where you can build up pressure and actually push. Another advantage of this position is that without even looking at the bike, you can immediately sense how the bars are positioned. So you can keep your eyes where you want to put the bike, apply pressure at the rear and push it in that direction, while easily steering at the front. That's one of the best positions for moving the bike backwards. Earlier we saw that it's best to push the bike from the left side, both forwards and backwards. But what if you've hardly got any space to the side? If you have to push into a very tight garage, then you can also push the bike while sitting on it. I'll show that briefly. Take a seat here. Now, you're in a normal riding position, so you've got very good contact with the bike. For shorter riders, though, that can be a bit of a problem because they don't have the same comfort I do of having really good contact with the ground with both feet. That makes it harder because the force you need to move the bike forwards or backwards can only be fed in through your feet. And for that, you need enough ability to walk the bike with your feet forwards or, of course, backwards. The advantage is that you need relatively little space left and right with this method, and you can support yourself well on both sides to keep the bike balanced. But as I said, it has limits, especially when pushing backwards, and even more so if it's uphill. Here's a small help you can use. If you need to turn the bike while maneuvering and push it up a slight incline or have to push it backwards up a slope, you can use the front suspension a bit by first compressing the fork and then using the rebound to help get the bike moving backwards. If you do that in small stages, you can often get the bike moving backwards even on a slight uphill without having to get off. It's a little trick and a small help to make things a bit easier. Pushing while seated is only one option when you don't have much room on either side. There's another method as well. It looks like this. I fold the stand out again. This is the one situation where we should leave the stand down, because if, for example, we have to maneuver the bike into a tight gap where we can't even get off to the side anymore, yeah, like we have here when bikes are parked in a line and there's only a space free in the middle, then we can do it from the front. And it's always good if the stand is already down. This isn't really meant for outdoors, but genuinely for a garage with level floors where you won't run the risk of the stand catching on something. Then you can pull the bike towards you from the front. You can steer, maneuver it and place it into the gap. And because the stand is down, you can then settle it onto the stand. But do check it again just to make sure it hasn't flipped up for some reason. Then you can lean the bike over and step away. That gives you the ability to position a bike very well into a very narrow space and park it there. Earlier we mentioned that to push the bike safely, you basically need secure footing and a good surface. But what if you don't have that? Then it's really about maneuvering the bike only in small steps, pushing it forwards and backwards bit by bit. The biggest danger with slippery or loose ground is when, in addition to pushing the bike, you also have to take steps yourself to keep moving along. In that case, it's recommended to move the bike only in small increments, then stop it or leave it steady, take a step with your feet to find secure footing again, and then move the bike again. So you shouldn't try to do it in one continuous movement. Do it in stages, always find a secure stance, and then move the bike on. We can demonstrate it briefly. If we had difficult ground here, I obviously can't move backwards with as much force or in one smooth push. So I do it like this. I use the bike, push it back a little bit, brake, and I can also use the brake to hold it in position. If it's downhill, then I've got the chance to step forward and then push it another meter and set it again. That's how you can help yourself if the surface is really tricky and you still need to place the bike safely from A to B. Another thing you should always keep in mind when pushing a bike from A to B is to do it calmly and take enough time. Most accidents happen when you try to do it quickly, and it's always better to approach it with patience. Every force you put into the bike should be smooth not jerky, because if you hit it with a lot of force somewhere, there's always the risk the bike moves in a direction you don't expect, or to the other side, which is always the dangerous side, because you can't follow it anymore. So make those movements slowly and start applying force gently to get the bike moving. Then you rarely run the risk of ending up in situations where you no longer have control of the bike. If you have to get a motorcycle up a ramp or a very steep incline, at some point your strength will simply be at its limit. But then you can use the engine to support you. And how to do that, we'll look at now with a real example. We've got a ramp in front of us here that simulates a proper steep incline. And if I try to push the bike up by hand, it becomes significantly more strenuous and probably almost impossible. If you don't want to come charging in with lots of momentum to overcome the incline, or you end up stopped halfway up and need to maneuver the bike from there, then you need the engine. What's the best way? I start the engine and let it idle. At idle, it generally already has enough power that if I select a gear and start letting the clutch out slowly, there's enough drive to get the bike moving, and I can walk alongside it quite comfortably while guiding it up the incline and bringing it up. And the best way to see how that works is to just do it. You can see we've got quite a steep ramp here. By hand, I've basically got no chance of getting the bike up, so I use the engine. As I said earlier, it's important that your lateral guidance is right. Don't be too far on the downhill side. That's very dangerous. You can tip easily, but also not too leaned over, because then at some point you need an extreme amount of force to keep the bike upright and you can't concentrate on maneuvering anymore. So an upright stance is important. I simply start the engine, select first gear, and then without giving any throttle, I can bring the bike up the ramp without any problem. And now we're up at the top and can maneuver the bike properly without having to use much force. And if you really do end up with the bike getting away from you, whether because of the bike's weight or your own, then it's often better, before you twist yourself up and injure yourself, to just let the bike go down slowly. Usually hardly anything happens, so if I really can't hold the bike anymore, I lay it down very slowly and I've basically got no problems. The contact points are usually here and on the foot peg, occasionally on the engine cover. You might get a small nick from stones and such, but major damage is usually avoided. We've already heard a lot about the right way to maneuver bikes, but there's another point you should keep in mind: parking the bike. With the side stand, that's fairly simple. You can fully swing it out and park the bike quite comfortably on the side. Here you just need to pay attention to a couple of things. First, make sure the stand is fully extended, because as you can see, due to the friction in the stand, it's possible that it isn't quite all the way out. If you then start leaning the bike onto it, it rolls over it and it folds in. So when you park the bike, please make sure the stand is right at the forward stop. That avoids this risk. There are a few exceptions: older bikes. I remember some Ducati models had an automatically retracting stand fitted. That means it didn't stay in the forward position. You had to actively hold it against the spring, pushing it forwards the whole time until the bike was resting on it. If you lifted the bike slightly, it would automatically flick back. That was a kind of safety measure, so you wouldn't ride off with the stand down if you forgot. Today, that's mainly done with a safety switch. That's why the engine usually cuts out when the stand is down. Back then, Ducati did it on some models by using an automatically folding stand. But it was really tricky, because swinging it out and keeping it out was awkward. And the risk was always there that if you lifted the bike, even briefly, the stand would fold back. You'd think it was still down, try to set the bike down again, and it would tip over. I've seen that happen many times. So with the side stand, you need to bear that in mind a bit, and of course also consider the surface. If you're parked on a slope where the bike is leaning against the incline, then the bike stands very upright, and you have to make sure it's stable. If you notice it's already too upright and no longer feels secure, it's better to push the bike somewhere else and change the slope's relationship to the stand, so there's no longer any risk of it tipping over. We've just talked about the side stand, but what about the center stand? Center stands are often used on touring bikes and older bikes, and they're also popular over winter, so the bike can be stored with the load taken off. But there are a few things to watch out for, because plenty of accidents have happened there too. Let's look at the best way to do it on this bike. We've got it on the side stand now. That's the best method when you just want to park the bike briefly, because it takes hardly any effort. With a center stand, you do need to apply some force, because you're more or less lifting the whole bike weight over that lever. And there are a couple of things to keep in mind. The big danger is if you want to put the bike onto the center stand when the bike isn't completely upright. Especially at the beginning, you tend to lean the bike towards you for safety. But then the problem is when you start setting the center stand down and pulling it up, the bike suddenly starts moving towards the other side. And then it tips over in that direction. The correct procedure with the center stand is this. You press it down and find the contact point where both feet of the stand, right and left, are on the ground. You can recognize it quite easily, because in that position the bike will more or less hold itself. Now, you don't really have to do anything, because the bike already has a basic stance and balance on those 2 feet. Then all you do is put your whole weight onto the stand and pull very slightly at the rear, and the bike should roll up onto the stand and then have a secure stance. You can see with heavy bikes, you do need a certain amount of strength. That's not really for very light riders. You need a bit of body weight, and then it's much easier. Once it's up, the bike stands securely. Of course, you need level ground. On a slope, this becomes critical, and I would definitely be careful. Another thing to keep in mind, if your bike has a lowering kit and so unfitted, the lever becomes even harder to overcome and you need more force. That's actually the case here, which is why I brought this bike in. It's got a slight lowering kit, and you can see you need more force. There are ways to adapt the stand for lowered bikes, so you don't have to heave the bike up as high, and so it comes up onto the stand more easily. That's basically the whole story you need to bear in mind. Taking it off is relatively simple. You can either sit on the bike and push forwards, or stand next to it and give it a small shove forwards over the stand so it drops down, and you automatically have the balance again. Earlier we looked at the top solutions for taking the load off the bike and parking it somewhere, but there are also very simple ways to park the bike upright and position it to a limited degree. Standard Paddock stands. You can get them for the rear and the front. With them, you can park the bike relatively safely and upright, without leaning it onto the side stand, as long as you don't have a center stand available. It's fairly straightforward. We have a system for the rear and one for the front. One thing to watch out for: you should always fit and lift the rear stand first. I'll demonstrate it briefly with the bike on the ground. When you slide the paddock stand into these 2 mounts, the bike more or less balances itself already, and then you can lift it quite easily with the lever at the back, and it stands nicely. You can do the same with the front stand. There are different systems here. We have pins, for example. If your fork has recesses at the bottom, you can slide into those recesses quite easily on both sides. Here you really need to make sure you're properly engaged, and then you can lift the bike with a quick motion, and then both wheels are unloaded, and you can, for example, park it over winter quite well. If you don't have those holes at the bottom, there are also L-shaped supports that sit on the outside of the fork, and likewise at the rear there are different options. On sport bikes, you often have threaded inserts on the swing arm where you can screw in these bobbins, usually small round discs, that you can hook into with a V-shaped cradle and then lift the bike up. If you don't have that, there are also L-shaped supports that go under the swing arm. Those have a rubberized contact surface, so you don't get ugly scratches, and you can do it that way as well. If you're trying to fit several bikes into a garage, always start with the biggest and heaviest bike. It's the hardest to handle, obviously, and positioning the smaller, lighter bikes afterwards is always easier than starting with the light ones and then trying to squeeze the big, heavy lump in at the end, worth keeping in mind. For those of you who really want to make life easy, there are of course some nice aids. For example, we've got a maneuvering aid here, the so-called Bikeboard. This gives you the option of getting the entire bike onto this maneuvering platform and then turning it in any direction. At the back, if we take a closer look, it has a ramp that helps the whole system make good contact with the ground, preventing unnecessary movement while you're loading the bike onto it. So we can simply press the ramp down. That pushes supports down onto the floor and lifts the rollers off the ground, which makes the platform very stable, so it can't roll away while you're riding the bike up. At the front, there's also a rocker that guides the front wheel into the front cradle and holds it there, so the bike's lateral balance is maintained at all times. Otherwise, the bike would fall over sideways while maneuvering, and this front system makes sure it's enough to roll the bike in there and then stabilize it laterally. And how that works, we'll take a look at right now. That's the whole process. You can see how the rocker at the front stabilizes the bike very well, and the V shape of the holder keeps everything secure. Now we can go ahead and fold the loading aid up at the back. That lowers the platform so it's sitting on the casters. And now I can move it super comfortably in any direction and position the bike exactly where I want it. I can push it sideways and park it anywhere depending on what's needed. And that's of course a huge comfort, especially in tight spaces. It helps massively with moving and positioning the bike, exactly like it often is for us, a big help. If you've already got lots of bikes in the workshop, you constantly have to move each one back and forth. With an aid like this, it's much easier to just push a bike to the side to make space without having to manhandle it around every time. If you want to have a bikeboard of your own, you'll find it at bikeboard.store. You can order one there. The price is 990 euros. It's not a bargain, but if you consider that it can prevent just one single tip over, then it's already paid for itself, and it makes handling the bike in cramped spaces enormously easier. We've just seen the Bikeboard, which makes maneuvering the bike much easier. But there's also a second option, and we don't want to keep it from you, the so-called Bursig stand. It does require a bit of preparation because you need to fit a small adapter to the bike for this stand. There are adapters for a wide range of bike types, and they're fitted to the bike in just a few minutes. Then you can quite comfortably grab the bike centrally with this lift right in the middle at the center of gravity, raise it, and the bike is once again completely free to move. Because the stand has casters that rotate all the way around, you've got every option here too. It is, however, a bit fiddly to use when you're on your own. You do have to concentrate a bit, where we'll still give it a try. If you've got a second person to help, it's obviously much easier. But let's see if I can manage it alone. That's it basically. Now you've got the bike completely free to move again. You saw how the lever automatically starts locking in as you lift the bike, and thanks to these two pins that fit very precisely into the guides, the whole bike can be raised. And it also has the advantage that all the wheels are freely movable. If you want to do maintenance checks on the bike and steering head bearings, inspections and so on, you can move everything without having the bike's own weight loading the wheels. That opens up a lot of possibilities, and as we mentioned at the start, also allows easy maneuvering of the bike in the workshop. And this Bursig stand isn't just suitable for the workshop, it's also quite popular at the track. It's used there as well because it lets you fit tire warmers to the bike quite comfortably without needing additional Paddock stands. If you want to buy one, you need to reckon with an investment of around 500 euros, and the individual mount for your motorcycle is already included. We've now heard a lot about proper handling and proper maneuvering of motorcycles. For many of you, this will probably sound very familiar and maybe not completely new. But for the beginners among you, there may have been one or two useful tips in here. One thing is definitely clear: nobody becomes a master overnight. So take your time, try recreating these situations with your bike and practice. How do I approach it? The more you move and handle the bike in these situations, the easier it will be in future to deal with them if you ever do end up in an awkward position or situation. Right? I hope you've picked up a few new things again. I'll get back to other motorcycle matters. I'll just say cheers, bye-bye. See you next time in the next Racelab.